There is a list buried inside the Texas State Library and Archives Commission that most people have never seen in full. It runs to fewer than 200 names. Some of the entries are spelled 2 or 3 different ways across different documents, because the clerks who recorded them were working fast, in the middle of a siege, and the men they were recording did not always agree on how their own names should be written down. The list is the muster of the Alamo garrison. The men who were present inside those limestone walls in the early hours of March 6, 1836, when the Mexican army under General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna breached the north wall and ended the 13-day siege in approximately 90 minutes of close combat. Every man on that list died before sunrise. What did not die was the name, and in the nearly 2 centuries since that morning, something has happened to those surnames that nobody fully anticipated when the first genealogical databases came online and families began tracing their lines with tools that earlier generations of researchers could not have imagined. Those surnames are everywhere. Not just in Texas, not just in the South, in county records across the Midwest, in census entries from Ohio and Illinois and Kansas and Oregon, in DNA matches that keep connecting living Americans to a cluster of families who were, by the official record, present at one of the most documented last stands in the history of North America. The question the genealogical record keeps pushing forward is not simply whether your family fought at the Alamo. The question is what it means that so many people, in so many places, carry the surnames that were inside those walls, and why the connection is so often the last thing the family tradition thought to mention, if it was mentioned at all. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Alamo was not, in 1836, the shrine it later became. So it was a former Franciscan mission, the Misión San Antonio de Valero, founded in the early 1700s to serve the indigenous population of the San Antonio River Basin. By the time the Texas Revolution broke out, it had been secularized for decades and was functioning primarily as a military outpost for whoever happened to control San Antonio de Bexar. The garrison that occupied it in February of 1836 was a mixed and improvised force, assembled under conditions of genuine uncertainty about whether reinforcements were coming, whether the political leadership of the Provisional Government of Texas would support them, and whether the intelligence about the size of Santa Anna's approaching army was accurate or badly underestimated. There were regular soldiers from the Texas Army, volunteers who had come from the United States entirely on their own initiative with no official commission or authorization, and Tejanos, Mexican-born Texians of Spanish and sometimes indigenous descent, who had made their political allegiance to the Texian cause for reasons that were personal, economic, and rooted in a specific understanding of Mexican federalism that the simplified mythology of the battle never had room to contain. That last group matters more to the genealogical record than most retellings acknowledge. The surnames they carried did not disappear from Texas after the battle. Many of them were already rooted in the region for generations before any Anglo-American settler arrived under an impresario land grant, and they remained rooted after the Republic of Texas was established, after annexation in 1845, and after the Civil War reshaped the social and economic geography of the entire state. The garrison was never the monolithic group of Anglo-American heroes that the mythology simplified it into. It was, by the surviving muster records and the testimony of survivors like Susanna Dickinson and the Tejano courier Juan Seguin, a genuinely diverse assembly of men whose surnames mapped onto 3 distinct migration streams that had been converging toward that courtyard from 3 different directions for 20 years. The first stream came out of the upland South. The Appalachian and Scots-Irish migration that had been moving through Tennessee, Kentucky, and the Cumberland Gap for 50 years before the Revolution brought a specific cluster of surnames to Texas in the early 1830s. David Crockett is the most famous name in this stream, but the surnames that appear more quietly in the muster records are the ones that show up most persistently in the genealogical databases, precisely because they were common enough to produce large collateral lines with many descendants. Ballantyne, Crossman, Dillard, Evans, Fishbaugh, Floyd, Garnett, Hawkins, Holland, Jackson, Jennings, Kent, Lewis, Maine, Miller, Mitchell, Moore, Rusk, Simmons, Taylor, Thomas, Walker, Ward, White, and Williamson. These are not exotic names. They are the common inventory of the upland South, the exact surnames you find clustered in the Appalachian counties of Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee in the 1790s and early 1800s, and then again in the Texas land grant records of the 1830s. What the migration pattern shows is not coincidence. It is a corridor. Families who had left Virginia moved into the Carolinas, then into Kentucky and Tennessee, then into Missouri and Arkansas, and then, following the impresario land grant system that the Mexican government had established to populate its northern territories, into the fertile river valleys and rolling grasslands of what is now Central and East Texas. By the time the Revolution broke out, these surnames had been traveling southwest for 2 full generations. The men who carried them to the Alamo were not pioneers in the wilderness sense of the word. They were the second and sometimes third generation of a migration that had a clear internal logic, land, and the relative absence of the institutions that made land in the eastern states expensive to acquire and difficult to keep. The second stream came from the Gulf Coast and the Deep South. Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama contributed a different set of surnames to the garrison, names that reflect the port culture and the plantation economy of the Gulf region, the world of cotton factors and river commerce, and the particular restlessness of men who found themselves on the margins of an established social order and moved toward the nearest available frontier. Autry, Bailey, Burns, Clark, Cochrane, Cottle, Cummings, Darst, Day, Dearduff, Duvalt, Furtleroy, Gaston, Goodrich, Gordon, Guerrero, Harris, Herndon, Kimball, King, Lightfoot, Lindley, Losoya, McDowell, McGee, Millsaps, Nava, Nelson, Northcross, Nowlin, Patton, Pollard, Roberts, Rose, Rutherford, Sewell, Smith, Starr, Sutherland, Thompson, Trammell, Waters, Wells, and Wolfe. The Gulf Coast stream is where the Tejano surnames begin to appear more densely in the muster records, because the social world of the Gulf Coast had more continuous contact with the Tejano communities of South Texas than the upland South Migration Corridor did. Losoya, Guerrero, and Nava are not Anglo-American names. They are Spanish surnames carried by men who were born in or near San Antonio, whose families had been in Texas for decades before any Anglo settler held a land grant, and whose decision to fight under the Texian flag was a political and personal choice made inside a conflict that was considerably more complicated than the English language mythology ever found it convenient to acknowledge. The third migration stream is the one that produces the most surprising genealogical results when researchers trace Alamo surnames back through the 19th century immigration records and into the port arrival manifests of the early 1800s. It is the direct immigration stream from Ireland, Scotland, England, and Germany that was moving through the American port cities of New Orleans, Baltimore, and New York in the 1820s and 30s. Men who arrived on the eastern seaboard or the Gulf Coast with no particular intention of going anywhere near Texas, but who were drawn west and south by cheap land, by political sympathy with the Texian cause after news of the Revolution reached the eastern cities, or by the particular combination of ambition and displacement that characterizes the immigrant experience in any era. Carey, Dimpkins, Fuqua, Gwynn, Hannum, Hutchinson, Irwin, Johnson, Kellogg, Kenny, McGregor, McKinney, Melton, Murphy, Spratt, Summerlin, and Zanko. Charles Zanko was Danish. Henry Warnell came from Arkansas but was born in Georgia to parents whose surname traced to England. The garrison at the Alamo was, in this sense, a cross-section of the migration patterns of the 1830s, assembled inside a single limestone compound, men in motion, carrying names that had already crossed one ocean and were now in the process of crossing a continent, stopped in their movement by a siege they had not anticipated and a battle that lasted less than 2 hours. To understand why the surname distribution looks the way it does in the genealogical databases today, it helps to think about what the 1930s and 1940s did to family memory. The children of the Texas veterans, the siblings and nephews and cousins of the Alamo garrison, were themselves aging and dying in the years after the Civil War, when the mythology of the battle was beginning to take the shape that the 20th century inherited. The Daughters of the Republic of Texas was founded in 1891. The Texas State Library began organizing the Alamo records more systematically around the same period. But by that time, the families who carried direct genealogical connections to the garrison had already been dispersed for 50 years through the westward migration, and the oral tradition that might have preserved the specific connection had thinned with every generation that moved farther from San Antonio. A family in Missouri in 1890, whose grandfather's brother had died at the Alamo in 1836, might have the story in a family Bible, might have it as a half-remembered reference at a dinner table, or might have lost it entirely, depending on whether the family had maintained correspondence with the Texas branch, whether the women who kept the family records had stayed in one place long enough to pass them on intact, and whether anyone in the intervening generations had thought the connection significant enough to write down and preserve. The surnames persisted even when the story did not. That is the central fact that the genealogical databases have been quietly demonstrating since the DNA surname projects began accumulating data. The name travels farther and survives more reliably than the oral tradition attached to it. The genome is a better archivist than the family reunion. What the DNA evidence has begun to show, in the decades since commercial genetic testing became widely available, is that the surnames associated with the Alamo garrison are not simply historical curiosities attached to a famous event. They are genetic markers in the most literal sense of the phrase. A surname that appears on the muster list, carried by a man who died without leaving children, might appear to be a genealogical dead end. The name stops at the Alamo, the line closes. But the garrison was not composed entirely of men without families elsewhere, and the surnames it contained were not unique to the individuals who carried them inside those walls. Every surname on the muster list had a broader family: brothers in Tennessee, fathers in Georgia, nephews in Missouri, cousins who had stayed behind in the Carolinas when the original upland South migration moved southwest. The surname that ended at the Alamo on the morning of March 6, 1836, continued through every one of those collateral lines, moving with the general westward migration of American families in the mid-19th century. And those continuation lines are what the genealogical databases have been quietly connecting to living Americans for the last 2 decades, one DNA match at a time. The specific case that genealogical researchers return to most often when documenting this phenomenon is the Bowie surname. James Bowie died at the Alamo almost certainly in the low barracks, confined to a cot and already gravely ill from what the surviving accounts describe as typhoid or possibly pneumonia that had advanced beyond the point where the garrison's medical resources could address it. He had no surviving children. His wife Ursula de Veramendi and their 2 children had died of cholera in 1833. 3 years before the siege. But the Bowie family was large, extending through South Carolina, Georgia, and Louisiana in collateral branches that continued producing descendants well into the 20th century. The DNA signature associated with the Bowie patrilineal line, the Y chromosome haplogroup that male line descendants of Rezin Bowie Sr., James Bowie's father, carry, has been documented in living men across at least 11 states, through the collaborative research of the Texas State Genealogical Society and the Bowie Surname DNA project maintained on the major genealogical platforms. The Bowie case receives consistent attention, partly because the name is famous enough to attract dedicated researchers who fund and participate in the Surname project with a degree of organization that less famous surnames rarely achieve. The quieter names on the muster list, Fishbaugh, Furtleroy, Dimkins, have received proportionally less attention, but the pattern, where it has been examined, is consistent with what the Bowie project shows. The garrison surnames did not end at the Alamo. They continued through collateral lines, spread through the westward migration of the mid-19th century, and deposited themselves in county records and church registries and probate files across a country that grew considerably larger and considerably more complicated in the decades after the battle than it had been in the decade before it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Tejano surnames require a separate accounting because their genealogical trajectory after the Revolution was shaped by forces that the Anglo-American surnames on the muster list largely avoided. Gregorio Esparza died at the Alamo. His brother Francisco, who had been fighting on the Mexican side under Santa Anna's command, was permitted by the general to retrieve his brother's body for burial, reportedly the only defender afforded that dignity, the distinction coming from Francisco's military service to the Mexican army rather than from any formal policy of the victors regarding the dead. Gregorio Esparza's wife Ana Salazar and their children had sheltered in the chapel with the other women and children of the garrison during the final assault, and they survived. Those children grew up in San Antonio. Their descendants are documented in the Tejano genealogical records of Bexar County through the late 19th century and into the 20th, the surname persisting in various spellings. Esparza appears in several census entries, Esparzar in at least one land record from 1851, as the clerical record tried and sometimes failed to standardize what it heard from a community that was conducting its own record-keeping in a different language. The physical record of the Alamo garrison itself has its own gaps and inconsistencies that complicate any claim about who was definitively present and who was not. The muster compiled after the battle was assembled from multiple sources: a list of volunteers that William Barrett Travis had been maintaining, testimony from survivors like Susanna Dickinson and the enslaved man known as Joe who had been Travis's servant, accounts collected from Mexican officers who had participated in the assault, and the recollections of San Antonio residents who had known some of the garrison members before the siege began. The final count of defenders accepted by the Texas State Library as the most accurate reconstruction of the available evidence is 189 names, though some researchers argue for numbers slightly higher or lower depending on how they treat the most ambiguous entries. Several names on the muster appear only once in the surviving documents, with no corroborating census record, no land grant entry, and no family connection that genealogists have been able to trace. For those names, the Surname project databases show either no matches at all or matches too distant and ambiguous to support a conclusion. But for the majority of the surnames on the list, the names that appear in multiple documents, that show up in the land grant records of the Republic period, that are traceable in the census of 1840 or 1850 under the same spelling or a recognizable variant, the collateral line research and the DNA project data are consistent with what the historical record would predict if the surname continued through brothers and cousins into the mid-19th century migration. The gaps in the muster are not evidence that the garrison was smaller or less diverse than the record indicates. They are evidence of the same documentary fragility that affects every historical record assembled under conditions of violence and institutional disruption. The siege ended in approximately 90 minutes of combat. The record of who was present was put together afterward by people who had not been inside the walls when the assault came through. The census record of 1850, 14 years after the Revolution, shows something that the genealogical literature has not fully absorbed. In the counties of South Texas and along the Rio Grande corridor, Spanish surnames that appear in the land grant records of the Republic period and in the Bexar County archives of the 1830s begin to disappear or transform. Lozoya becomes Lacey in one entry. Guerrero is recorded in a neighboring county in the same census year under a form that obscures its Spanish origin to the point of unrecognizability. The families in question did not move. The surname moved around them, reshaped by the phonetic assumptions of Anglo-American census takers who were transcribing what they heard rather than what was said, working in a script and a language that had no obvious place for the specific sounds of Spanish surnames with indigenous or Moorish etymological roots. What the DNA studies of South Texas populations have shown, in research conducted through the University of Texas at San Antonio and through the genealogical programs of Tejano historical societies over the last 2 decades, is that the genetic diversity of the region does not match the ethnic simplification of the 19th century census. Families recorded as white in 1850 carry maternal haplogroups associated with indigenous Mesoamerican populations. Families recorded under anglicized surnames carry paternal lineages that trace to the Canary Island settlers who founded San Antonio in 1731. The erasure in the census record is not the erasure of the Alamo story specifically. It is the erasure of the complexity that was always inside it, the same complexity that produced a garrison of fewer than 200 men who spoke English, Spanish, and in some cases Gaelic, who held land grants under 2 different legal systems, and who died in the same courtyard regardless of what language they prayed in during the 13 days before the assault. The migration of Alamo surnames out of Texas in the decade after the Revolution followed a pattern that the land records and census entries can partially reconstruct. The Republic of Texas was economically difficult from its first months. Land that had been granted to settlers under the Mexican impresario system was disputed in the new Republic's courts. The legal infrastructure of the new government was conducted in English and operated through procedures that were unfamiliar to Tejano families whose land titles had been issued in Spanish under a different set of legal conventions with different requirements for documentation and attestation. Some families left Texas during the Republic period, moving back into Louisiana or north into Arkansas. Some stayed and lost land through the probate and title dispute systems of the 1840s. Some anglicized their surnames as a practical adaptation to a legal environment that was more navigable under an English-sounding name, a pattern that appears in the Bexar County probate records as early as 1842 and continues through the annexation period into the early statehood years. The Anglo-American surnames that left Texas in the same decade moved back through the same migration corridors that had delivered them there. They show up in the census records of Missouri and Arkansas in 1850 and 1860, sometimes under variant spellings, sometimes with occupation records that suggest a family had restarted in a new county with no particular acknowledgement of whatever had brought them to Texas in the first place and driven them back out of it a decade later. The Crockett Surname Project, documented through the research publications of the Crockett Family Association and the results posted to the Family Tree DNA Surname Database, has identified Y chromosome matches connecting living men with the Crockett surname to a common patrilineal ancestor who fits. Within the margin of error that genetic dating allows for the relevant number of generations, the lineage of John Crockett, born in 1753 in Lincoln County, North Carolina, and father of the David Crockett who died at the Alamo. David Crockett left no sons who survived to adulthood in Tennessee. His brothers and their male line descendants continued the patrilineal line through the mid-19th century, and the DNA Project has now identified matches in Tennessee, Missouri, Kentucky, Kansas, and Oregon, the westward migration corridor laid out in the land and census records of the mid-19th century, the same corridor that carried every other upland South surname west in the decades after the Revolution. The surname did not end at the Alamo. It traveled the same route that Scots-Irish and upland South families had been traveling for 100 years, moving west and slightly north, following the land. What makes the Alamo surname question more than a simple genealogical exercise is the way the DNA evidence sits against the mythology. The official story of the Alamo, as it was taught in Texas schools through most of the 20th century, was a story about a small number of Anglo-American heroes who died for the principle of Texian liberty. The Tejano defenders were not always named in that version. The complexity of the political situation, which included Mexican Federalists, Anglo-American colonists, and Tejano families who had their own distinct reasons for or against the revolution, reasons that were shaped by land ownership, by family connection, by economic interest, and by a reading of Mexican constitutional law that differed from Santa Anna's reading, was simplified into a binary of freedom and tyranny that left out most of what actually happened in the preceding decade. What the genealogical record shows is that the garrison was never that simple, and that the surnames it left behind are distributed across populations that the simplified version of the story did not always acknowledge. The Hispanic families of South Texas who carry surnames that appear on the muster records are genealogically connected to the battle in ways that the 20th century mythology did not include. The Scots-Irish families of the Ozarks who carry upland South surnames from the muster list are connected in ways that the family tradition sometimes preserved and sometimes forgot entirely, depending on how many generations had passed and how far the family had moved from the county where the original connection was documented. The surname evidence also raises a question about which direction the genealogical investigation should run. Most people who suspect an Alamo connection begin with the famous name, Crockett, Bowie, Travis, and try to trace a direct descent from the specific individual who died in the battle. That search almost always ends quickly, because the men in question either had no children or had children who died without issue before producing the lines that would carry a genetic signature to the present. The more productive investigation runs through the collateral lines, beginning with the surname and working backward through the county records of the states the family occupied in the mid-19th century, looking for a convergence point in the generation before the Revolution. A family named Miller in a Kansas county in 1880, whose grandfather was born in Tennessee in 1810, is not far genealogically from the window of the Alamo garrison. Miller appears on the muster list. The Tennessee birth date fits the migration pattern. The question is whether the Kansas Miller and the Alamo Miller connect through a common ancestor in the generation of John Miller, or whoever held the surname before the Tennessee branch diverged from the Texas branch. That is the research the surname DNA projects are designed to enable, and it is the research that is still ongoing in most of the smaller surname clusters on the muster list. Databases are not yet large enough to answer every question, but they are large enough to show that the questions are real, that the connections exist, and that the list of fewer than 200 names inside the Texas State Library archives is not a closed record. It is an open genealogical investigation running in real time, one DNA submission at a time. The census records do not explain every surname on the muster list. The land grants do not cover every family that left descendants. The DNA projects are not complete, and the Tejano lines remain underrepresented in the commercial databases because the communities carrying those surnames have participated in genetic genealogy at lower rates than the Anglo-American lines, for reasons that are partly economic and partly a product of the same historical relationship to institutions that produced the census misclassifications of the 1850s. What exists in the overlap between the muster list and the genealogical evidence and the surname DNA project's still accumulating matches is a body of material that keeps pointing in the same direction. The men who died at the Alamo carried surnames into that courtyard that did not die with them. The names continued through brothers and cousins and nephews whose own migrations deposited them across the country in the decades after the Revolution. The genome carries the record of that continuation in every DNA match that connects a living person to a surname cluster, tracing back to Texas in 1836. The oral tradition may have faded. The family Bible may have been lost in one of the moves west. The specific story of a great-great-grandfather's brother who went to Texas in the winter of 1835 and never came back may have been condensed into a vague family memory about ancestors who were in the South somewhere, or in Texas once, or who the family had simply lost track of generations ago. But the surname remained, the DNA remained, the census entries of the collateral lines remained, waiting in the county archives of a dozen states for the researcher who would think to look one county farther, one generation earlier, one spelling variant away from where the family tradition placed the story. Your family tree might already contain the connection. The list is fewer than 200 names. The living population carrying those surnames is orders of magnitude larger. The distance between the two is where the genealogical work remains to be done. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.